Alright, so for this video we're going to be looking at something which is exceptionally important for students and for their teachers, and that is the question that always comes up from students: what is my final mark? So I'm going to show you the way of doing the calculation. I know there are apps out there that you can plug in your numbers, but I think it's much more beneficial if you understand how to calculate your final mark based on term and exam. So for the examples that I'm doing, I'm going to be using the standard we have at our board, which is a term is worth 70% of your final and your exam is worth 30. So term is 70%, exam is 30. We have a student, for example 1, they have a mark for the term of 79.3%, and they get 75.1% on the exam, and they want to know what their final mark is going to be. So the calculation is, you take your term mark, you multiply it by 0.7 because that is equivalent to 70%. That will give you 55%. So that is their mark overall in the course before adding in the exam. They got a 75.1% on the exam. So take that multiplied by 0.3 because that's equivalent to 30%, giving you 22.53. Then we add those two together, so 55.51, there's your term, 22.53 is your exam. Put them together and this person will have an overall mark of 78.04. Example 2. In this case, the student has done quite well on the exam. They had a 64% going in. They got an 85% on the exam. They want to know what their final mark is going to be. So again, we take our term mark multiplied by 0.7. That is equivalent to 70%. That gives them a 45.08%. The exam is 30%. So 85.1 times 0.3 gives you 25.53. Their total mark, combining term and exam, is 70.61. So they had a mid-60s going into the exam. They did quite well on the exam with an 85%. That boosts their overall mark to a 70.61. So another question that comes up quite often with students is, what do I need just to pass? So you're getting ready to go into the exam and they want to know that minimum mark so that they can get their credit. So let's do a couple of combinations of that. So for instance, you have a term mark of 65.3%. So like we've done in the past, we will take that and multiply it by 0.7. So all of the work they've done for the term, which is worth 70%, would give them a 45.71. So I essentially let them know that if you got 0 on the exam, you went in, you didn't answer any questions, you would end up having an overall mark of 45.7. which means they need around 4% on the exam just to pass. For a second example, we have a student with an 85.4%. We take their term mark, we multiply it by 0.7, and that shows us that they have a 59.78. And again, if they got 0 on the exam, this would be their final mark. When we look at this kind of a calculation, I always like to discuss with the students whether or not they would be satisfied with ending up with a 59.8% average, considering the fact that for the entire term they've been working to get an 85%. And the last question that students like to ask is, what is the highest possible mark I can get? So here's an example. Let's say, for instance, you have a 64% as a course mark, and if you were to get the highest possible, that means you have to get 100% on the exam. So 70% of your term mark would give you a 45.08, and if you were to get 100%, we multiply that 0.3, so that gives you a full 30%. And for this student, when we add those together, the highest mark they can possibly get is a 75.08. So this student had a relatively high mark going in. They had an 86.3. They want to know their highest possible mark, which means they must have gotten 100% on the exam. So we take their term mark and we multiply it by 0.7, which gives you a 60.41. They got 100% on the exam, so we multiply that by 0.3, which gives you a 30%. And when we add those together, we see that they can go up to a 90.4. Now, a lot of students will say, well, that doesn't make sense. It only went up a little bit, and that is simply because you already have a very high mark. So you're almost at a 90. you're getting 100% on the exam, but it's worth 30% of the overall. So the maximum this person can possibly get is 90. So once again, learn how to do these calculations, impress yourself and impress your teacher instead of just using an app to figure out your final mark.